Chapter 1: The Dead Team Problem. The fluorescent tubes in Conference Room B17 at Vistaprint's Lexington, Massachusetts headquarters emitted a hum pitched somewhere between a dying refrigerator and a dental drill. The sound was constant enough to become invisible after 20 minutes and irritating enough to resurface in the 31st. Jason Robbins had timed it. He had also timed the walk from his cubicle to B17. 4 minutes and 14 seconds at normal pace, 3 minutes and 41 at the stride he used when carrying coffee. The boot-up cycle of the room's 27-inch presentation monitor. 9 minutes if the first remote worked, 15 if he had to locate the second, and the average delay between a meeting's scheduled start time and the moment the last participant stopped adjusting their chair and made eye contact with whoever was speaking. That delay was 6 minutes and 40 seconds. Robbins had logged it across 37 consecutive Friday afternoon meetings. The measurement was not casual. Multiplied across 52 weeks and 12 regular attendees, the 6-minute and 40-second gap represented 692 person-hours of annual productivity loss. He had submitted the calculation to his manager in a memo titled Quantifiable Meeting Initiation Latency. The memo had not been acknowledged. Vistaprint in 2011 was a company that made money helping other companies print business cards, brochures, and promotional magnets. It was publicly traded, profitable, headquartered in a building whose lobby featured a display wall of its own products. Refrigerator magnets bearing the logos of lawn care services and dental practices. Several hundred employees arrived each morning to optimize click-through rates on digital advertisements for customized stationery. The work was steady, legal, and boring, with a thoroughness that left no corner of the day unflattened. Robbins was 28. He had graduated from Duke University in 2006 with a degree in business and had spent the intervening 5 years in a series of positions whose titles included the words analyst, strategy, and optimization in various combinations. He was thin, wore wire-rimmed glasses, and possessed a quality that former colleagues would later describe with remarkable consistency: an inability to encounter a system without identifying its inefficiencies and developing, often unsolicited, a proposal for their elimination. A fantasy football league was a system. A restaurant menu was a system. The organizational structure of a Fortune 500 company was a system. Robbins engaged with all three in the same register, as optimization problems awaiting solutions. His desk at Vistaprint was organized with the geometric precision of a man who believed that physical order produced cognitive order. Blue pens sorted by ink density. Notebooks open to pre-numbered pages. A tablet propped beside the keyboard, displaying what colleagues assumed was work, but was in fact a spreadsheet tracking every member of his fantasy football league. The spreadsheet contained, according to former coworkers who had glimpsed it over his shoulder, not merely draft picks and weekly scores, but behavioral data. Each league member's decision-making patterns, risk tolerance, historical trade timing, and what Robbins privately categorized as exploitable irrationality indicators. He had achieved what he described to friends as 94.7% predictive accuracy for his league mates' draft selections, a figure whose precision suggested either genuine analytical talent or the particular variety of confidence that accompanies an unchallenged methodology. Matt Kalish was 29. He had attended the University of Wisconsin and carried the conversational energy of a man who had consumed one more cup of coffee than the situation required. Where Robbins processed the world through spreadsheets and probability models, Kalish processed it through marketing frameworks. Customer acquisition costs, lifetime value ratios, conversion funnels, the mechanics by which a person moved from not knowing a product existed to spending money on it. His cubicle at Vistaprint was organized around a whiteboard on which he maintained in dry erase ink refreshed weekly a flowchart of his personal daily routine annotated with efficiency calculations. Former coworkers remembered 2 things about the flowchart: that it was genuinely useful and that it included a time allocation for unstructured social interaction blocked in 15-minute increments. Kalish's professional instinct was for growth. He could look at a product and see not what it was, but what it needed to become. and the gap between the two states registered in his mind as a marketing problem whose solution was a funnel, a sequence of steps, each one engineered to move the user closer to the transaction. He had brought this instinct to Vistaprint, where it was wasted on business card promotions, and he had brought it to his personal life, where it produced social interaction frameworks that treated human relationships with the same analytical rigor he applied to customer retention models. The rigor was genuine. The results were mixed. Human beings were less predictable than click-through rates, a fact that irritated him. Paul Liberman was 30. He was the engineer. Where Robbins built the models and Kalish designed the funnels, Liberman built the things that made the models and funnels work in the physical world of servers, databases, code, and user interfaces. He held a degree from Georgia Tech and had the temperament common to engineers who have spent enough time debugging production systems to know that elegant theory and functional reality are separated by a gap that only labor can close. His apartment in Watertown occupied a 2-bedroom unit in a building whose chief amenity was proximity to a laundromat. The second bedroom contained the components of what his roommate described as either a very advanced home automation project or the early stages of a domestic surveillance operation. Half-finished robotics projects shared workbench space with custom database systems, a home automation setup that could adjust lighting based on circadian rhythm data, and a coffee machine whose operation Liberman had linked to his alarm clock through a custom API. The three men had become friends at Vistaprint through the mechanism by which most workplace friendships form: proximity, shared complaints, and a mutual recognition that they were, in the vocabulary of their generation, underemployed. They ate lunch together most days. They talked about the companies they admired, the startups in Cambridge and San Francisco raising capital and building products that mattered, and they talked about the gap between where they were and where they wanted to be. The gap had the dimensions of a specific frustration. They were smart enough to build something, experienced enough to know what building required, and stuck in an organization whose ambitions did not extend beyond the next quarter's click-through rate on a banner advertisement for custom rubber stamps. They also played fantasy football, all three. Every season, multiple leagues, and every season, the same thing happened. The conversation that produced DraftKings has been recounted by the founders in dozens of interviews, investor presentations, and public appearances over the 13 years since it occurred. The details vary in emphasis but not in substance. The setting was not Conference Room B17. It was a bar, or possibly a restaurant, or possibly Robbins' apartment. The founders have placed the conversation in multiple locations across multiple retellings, a common feature of origin stories polished by repetition. The date was sometime in the fall of 2011, football season. The subject was fantasy football, and the specific complaint that Jason Robbins articulated was this: the season was only 6 weeks old, and half the league had stopped paying attention. He called it the dead team problem. The traditional fantasy football model required users to draft a roster before the NFL season opened in September and manage that roster through 16 weeks of regular season play. If a user's roster performed poorly in the early weeks, the user was trapped. A first-round draft pick suffering a season-ending injury in Week 2. A projected breakout running back averaging 2 yards per carry. Bye weeks aligning in a way that left the roster depleted at a critical moment. The roster was dead. The season still had 10 weeks to go. The entry fee was already paid. The user could continue managing a losing team for 3 more months, or the user could stop logging in. Most users stopped logging in. The attrition was structural, not incidental. Season-long fantasy leagues lost participants the way a leaky boat lost buoyancy. Slowly at first, then with the sudden finality of Week 8, when mathematical elimination became unavoidable, and the remaining weeks transformed from competition into obligation. Industry data from the period indicated that engagement in season-long fantasy leagues dropped by approximately 50% between Week 1 and Week 12. Half the participants in any given league were functionally gone before Thanksgiving. This problem was obvious to anyone who played fantasy sports, and obvious in the specific way that the best startup insights are obvious, visible to everyone, articulated by almost no one, and solvable only by someone willing to restructure the entire product around the solution. Robin's solution was compression. What if the fantasy experience lasted one day instead of one season? What if users drafted a new roster every morning and received their results every night? What if the entry fee was small, $1 or $5 or $20, and the contest settled before the user went to sleep? No dead teams, no 3-month commitment, no week 8 attrition. Every day was opening day. Every contest was a fresh start. The product would generate engagement not through long-term investment, but through repetition. The same structure, repeated daily, each iteration independent of the last, each result delivered fast enough that the user could play again tomorrow. The idea was not entirely new. FanDuel, a New York-based company founded in 2009, had been operating a daily fantasy platform for 2 years and had demonstrated that the market existed. The concept of compressing fantasy sports into shorter formats had been discussed in industry forums and experimented with by smaller operators. What was new was the specific combination of analytical, marketing, and engineering talent that Robbins, Kalish, and Liberman represented and the thoroughness with which they intended to execute. They did not want to build a daily fantasy product. They wanted to build the daily fantasy product, the one that would define the category. Kalish grasped the monetization before Robbins finished the sentence. A season-long fantasy league collected 1 entry fee per user per season. A daily fantasy product could collect 1 entry fee per user per day. A user who paid $50 once in September could pay $5 200 times between September and February. The revenue potential was not additive, it was multiplicative. He ran the math. A user who played 3 contests per week at an average entry fee of $10 across a 30-week sports calendar covering NFL, NBA, MLB, and NHL seasons represented $900 in annual entry fees. At a rate of 10%, the platform's cut of each contest's prize pool, that user generated $90 in annual revenue. 100,000 such users produced $9 million. 1 million produced $90 million. The numbers were hypothetical, but the math was not aspirational. It was structural. The daily format, by its nature, created more transactions per user than the seasonal format, and more transactions meant more opportunities to collect the rake. Liberman assessed the technical requirements. The product needed a drafting interface capable of handling thousands of simultaneous users, selecting players under a salary cap constraint. It needed a scoring engine processing real-time statistical feeds from multiple sports leagues, calculating fantasy point totals within minutes of a game's conclusion. It needed a payment system handling high-volume, low-dollar transactions without the processing fees consuming the margin. And it needed a contest management system, generating, populating, and settling hundreds of distinct contests per day, each with its own entry fee, prize structure, and participant cap. The technical challenge was significant, but not unprecedented. The payment infrastructure existed, the statistical data feeds existed, the engineering was labor-intensive, but well within the capabilities of a small, skilled team with access to cloud computing resources. The bottleneck was not technology. It was capital, regulatory clarity, and time. They decided to build it. The company was incorporated on December 31, 2011 in the state of Delaware, a jurisdictional choice dictated by Delaware's corporate-friendly legal framework, and so standard in American startup formation that it required no discussion. The 3 founders divided responsibilities along the lines their skills dictated. Robbins as CEO, responsible for strategy, fundraising, and the analytical models underpinning the product's economics. Kalish as the head of marketing and customer acquisition, responsible for the challenge of convincing sports fans to try a product category most of them had never encountered, and Liberman as the chief technology officer, responsible for building and maintaining the platform that would process every contest, every draft, every deposit, and every payout. The first office was Liberman's spare bedroom in Watertown. The room measured approximately 10 feet by 12 feet and contained, by the time the company occupied it, 3 desks, pushed together in a configuration that forced the occupants to negotiate elbow space. 2 monitors per desk purchased, used at a cost Liberman tracked in a personal accounting spreadsheet, a whiteboard mounted on the back of the door, and a router whose signal strength Liberman had mapped room by room to identify the optimal desk placement for each team member's primary device. The kitchen served as the conference room. The bathroom served as the only space in the apartment where a phone call could be conducted without the other two founders hearing both sides of the conversation. They worked from the apartment through the winter of 2012, building the platform in preparation for a launch timed to coincide with Major League Baseball's opening day in April. The choice of baseball was strategic. The NFL was the dominant sport in American fantasy leagues, but the NFL season did not begin until September, and the founders could not afford to wait 6 months to test their product. Baseball offered 162 games per team across a season running from April through October, a volume of daily contests that would stress test the platform's infrastructure while generating the engagement data needed to refine the product before football season arrived. The seed round closed in early 2012. The amount was $1.4 million, raised from a small group of angel investors and early-stage venture capitalists. The money was enough to hire the first engineers, lease server capacity, and fund the initial customer acquisition campaign, which, in the spring of 2012, consisted primarily of online advertisements targeted at fantasy sports message boards and social media accounts associated with baseball statistics communities. The marketing budget was, by the standards of what the company would later spend, negligible. Kalish tracked every dollar of acquisition cost against every dollar of revenue generated, building the unit economics models that would eventually justify the hundreds of millions in venture capital that followed. On April 5, 2012, the first DraftKings contest went live. It was a one-on-one baseball format. 2 users drafting rosters under a salary cap, with the higher-scoring roster winning the prize. The salary cap mechanism was the product's defining feature. Each player in the available pool was assigned a dollar value based on projected performance, and users were given a fixed budget of $50,000 in fantasy dollars to assemble a roster. The constraint forced trade-offs. A user who spent $12,000 on the best pitcher in the pool had $38,000 remaining for the rest of the roster. A user who spread the budget evenly sacrificed the advantage of a dominant individual performer for the stability of a balanced team. The strategy space was deep enough to reward skill, accessible enough to attract casual players, and variable enough to ensure that no single strategy dominated across multiple contests. Player prices changed daily based on matchups, injuries, and recent performance. The puzzle reset every morning. The product worked. Users played. Users returned. Users deposited money, entered contests, won or lost, and deposited again. The daily cycle that Robbins had theorized produced the behavior he had predicted. No dead teams, no Week 8 drop-offs. The engagement curve was flat where the season-long model's curve was a cliff, and inside the flatness was something else. A rhythm. Deposit in the morning, draft at lunch, result before bed, a loss on Tuesday, a new contest on Wednesday. The daily cycle was not just solving the dead team problem, it was creating a loop. Deposit, play, result, repeat. The settlement was immediate. The next opportunity was immediate. The gap between a loss and the chance to recover the loss was measured in hours, not months. The founders did not describe this rhythm as a dopamine loop. That language belonged to a different vocabulary, the vocabulary of behavioral psychology, of addiction research, of the regulatory hearings that would arrive 3 years later. In 2012, the rhythm was the product working as designed. The compression that solved the dead team problem was the same compression that made the product difficult to put down. The features that eliminated attrition were the same features that promoted retention. The line between engaging and addictive was not visible in the product's architecture because the architecture did not distinguish between the two. Engagement and addiction produced identical data signatures, frequent logins, recurring deposits, daily participation. The system measured both with the same metrics and rewarded both with the same response. More contests, more opportunities, more chances to play. The system was working. The founders could see it in the numbers. The numbers were growing. Somewhere in the first months of the platform's operation, a user made a deposit that exceeded his recreational budget. The date is not recorded because the event was not, at the time, an event. He was a real person, one of the thousands who found the platform in its first baseball season through the message boards and social media advertisements that Kalish's marketing operation had seeded across the internet's fantasy sports communities. His name does not appear in any regulatory filing or court document. He was not a victim in the legal sense. He was a customer who used the product as the product was designed to be used. He deposited $20 on a Monday. He lost. He deposited $20 on Tuesday. He lost. He deposited $20 on Wednesday and won $35, a net gain of $15 that, combined with the prior losses, left him $25 behind for the week. He deposited $20 on Thursday. By Friday, his weekly spending on DraftKings contests exceeded the amount he had budgeted for recreational entertainment. He did not track the overage in the moment. The deposits were small. The contests were quick. The results arrived before he had time to calculate the cumulative total. The platform did not calculate it for him. The interface displayed his account balance, the funds available for wagering, but not his net deposit history, not his cumulative losses, not the ratio of money deposited to money withdrawn. These figures were available if the user navigated to the account settings page and scrolled past the promotional offers to the transaction history tab. But the interface was not designed to surface them. The interface was designed to surface the next contest. This user was not the subject of any investigation, any lawsuit, any regulatory action. He was a data point. His deposits and losses fed the same models that every other user's deposits and losses fed, and the models grew more accurate with each additional data point, learning to predict not just who would play, but when they would play, how much they would spend, and what promotional offer would be most effective at bringing them back after a losing streak. He was the first ripple. The wave was still 13 years away, but the system was learning. By the end of the 2012 baseball season, DraftKings had processed enough contests to confirm the founder's thesis. The daily format generated higher engagement, lower attrition, and more revenue per user per season than the traditional model. The numbers were small in absolute terms. The company was still operating from an apartment, still employing fewer than 10 people, still spending less on marketing in a month than it would later spend in an hour. But the unit economics were compelling. The cost to acquire a user was declining. The revenue per user was stable. The retention curve was flat. The flat retention curve was the number that mattered most. It meant that users who tried the product continued using the product. It meant that the daily cycle was self-reinforcing. It meant that the product did not need to be resold to existing users. It only needed to be maintained. The engineering of engagement had been accomplished. What remained was the engineering of scale. The founders spent the fall of 2012 preparing for their first NFL season. Football was the sport that would determine whether the company was a niche product for baseball statistics enthusiasts or a mass-market platform for the 60 million Americans who played fantasy football. The preparation involved hiring additional engineers, expanding server capacity, and building the contest structures that would accommodate the NFL's weekly schedule. Thursday night games, the Sunday afternoon slate, Sunday night football, Monday night football, each requiring its own contest format, its own salary cap structure, its own settlement cycle. The NFL season arrived, and the users arrived with it. Growth was organic in the early weeks. Word of mouth among fantasy communities, social media sharing by early adopters. The network effects that accrue to any product whose value increases with the number of participants. The contests were competitive, the payouts were real, and the daily format delivered on its promise. No dead teams, no mid-season attrition, a fresh start every Thursday, every Sunday, every Monday. The founders tracked the deposits, the contest entries, the retention rates, the revenue per user. The numbers confirmed what the baseball season had suggested. The product had market fit. The daily fantasy format solved a real problem, served a real demand, and generated real revenue at a scale that justified the next phase of investment. In early 2013, they closed a larger funding round and moved out of Liberman's apartment into commercial office space in Boston. They hired aggressively: engineers, marketers, customer service representatives, a compliance officer to navigate the regulatory landscape that no one, in the spring of 2013, had yet examined with any rigor. The move from the spare bedroom to the office was a threshold the founders crossed without ceremony. The apartment in Watertown had served its purpose. The whiteboard on the back of the bedroom door still bore the faded remnants of server architecture diagrams and contest structure flowcharts. The router, whose signal strength Liberman had mapped, remained in the living room, connected to nothing. The desks were separated and returned to their original locations against the walls. Liberman kept the spare bedroom as a spare bedroom. He did not preserve it as a monument to the company's founding. He cleaned the whiteboard, repositioned the furniture, and reclaimed the room for the purpose it had been designed to serve. The founding was over. The building had begun. They were constructing something. They could feel it accelerating. The product worked. The users were growing. The money was flowing. The database of sports-obsessed consumers was expanding with every contest, every deposit, every login, every data point that fed the models that predicted who would play and when they would play and how much they would spend. What they were constructing, the full architecture of what the daily fantasy product would become, the verticals it would enable, the algorithms it would feed, the regulatory confrontations it would provoke, the lives it would enrich, and the lives it would damage, was not yet visible. The spare bedroom was behind them. The $6 billion was ahead. Between the two lay a distance measured not in years but in decisions, each one rational within its own frame, each one building on the last, each one carrying the company further from the apartment in Watertown and closer to the notification that would arrive, 13 years later at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, addressed to a woman whose name the system did not need to know. Chapter 2: The League's Blessing. The email arrived on a Monday morning in March 2013, routed through a general inquiries address that Paul Liberman had set up during the company's first week of operation, and that received, on average, 40 messages per day, most of them customer support requests about deposit processing times and contest scoring disputes. The email was not a customer support request. It was from an executive in Major League Baseball's Business Development Division, and it contained a sentence that Jason Robbins would later describe in an investor presentation to a room full of venture capitalists as the moment the company became real. The sentence asked whether DraftKings would be interested in discussing a strategic partnership. Robbins read the email at 7:14 a.m., standing in the kitchen of the Boston office the company had occupied since moving out of Liberman's spare bedroom 2 months earlier. The office was a step up from the apartment in Watertown, but only in the sense that a studio apartment is a step up from a sleeping bag. The space occupied the second floor of a commercial building near Fenway Park, and its chief amenities were a conference room that doubled as a storage closet, a kitchenette whose microwave produced a smell on Tuesdays that no amount of cleaning could explain, and enough desk space for the 12 employees who now constituted the entire company. The rent was $40,200 per month, a figure that represented approximately 8% of the company's monthly operating budget, and that Robbins tracked on the same spreadsheet where he tracked every other dollar the company spent, down to the $11.47 weekly expense for the coffee that kept the engineering team functional during the 18-hour days that had become standard. He forwarded the email to Kalish and Liberman. Then he read it again. Major League Baseball wanted to talk. Not a licensing agreement, not a sponsorship deal. A strategic partnership, which in the vocabulary of professional sports business development carried a specific implication. The league was considering an equity investment. No major American professional sports league had ever taken an equity stake in a daily fantasy sports operator. The NFL maintained a policy of strategic distance from any business that involved real money wagering on player performance, even wagering that federal law classified as a game of skill rather than gambling. The NBA had expressed public skepticism about the regulatory status of DFS. The NHL had not engaged with the category at all. Among the four major leagues, only MLB had signaled openness to the intersection of fan engagement and real money gaming, and even that openness had been limited to tentative discussions at industry conferences where league executives and DFS operators shared panels and exchanged business cards without committing to anything that might generate a headline. An equity investment would be different. An equity investment would mean that the league's name, its institutional credibility, and its implied endorsement would attach to DraftKings' product. The brand trust implications were enormous. A fantasy sports platform endorsed by amateurs on internet message boards was a startup. A fantasy sports platform endorsed by Major League Baseball was an institution. Robbins understood this with the clarity of a man who had spent the previous 12 months trying to persuade skeptical users, cautious investors, and indifferent media outlets that daily fantasy sports was a legitimate product category and not, as one early press inquiry had phrased it, online gambling with a jersey on. The legitimacy problem was the company's most expensive challenge. Customer acquisition costs were elevated because potential users distrusted the product's legality. Venture capital was difficult to raise because investors distrusted the regulatory environment. Media coverage was difficult to secure because journalists distrusted the distinction between skill-based contest and bet. Every conversation about DraftKings arrived at the same question, delivered in tones ranging from polite curiosity to open hostility. But isn't this just gambling? An MLB investment would not answer the question, but it would change who was asking it. If a reporter could write DraftKings, in which Major League Baseball holds an equity stake, the frame shifted. The question was no longer whether the product was legitimate. The question was why the most venerable institution in American professional sports had decided it was. The negotiations took 6 weeks. The details of the investment have been disclosed in subsequent regulatory filings and public reporting, though the precise valuation at which MLB acquired its stake has not been made public. What is known is that in April 2013, Major League Baseball completed a strategic investment in DraftKings, making it the first major American professional sports league to take an equity position in a daily fantasy sports operator. The announcement was modest by the standards of what the company would later produce. A press release, a handful of trade publication stories, a brief mention in the sports business section of a few national outlets. The investment was small enough in dollar terms to be categorized as a strategic bet rather than a major capital commitment, and the league's communications team framed it carefully. This was an investment in fan engagement technology, not an endorsement of gambling. The distinction mattered to the league. It would matter to regulators. It would, in time, become the central question of a nationwide legal debate that would cost DraftKings millions of dollars in legal fees and come close to destroying the company. But in April 2013, the distinction held, and the effect on DraftKings' business was immediate. The MLB logo appeared on the company's website and marketing materials. The league's data became available through an enhanced partnership agreement, allowing DraftKings to offer more detailed statistical information to users building their baseball rosters. The company's sales team, such as it was, could now open every conversation with a sentence that had been unavailable to them 48 hours earlier. We're backed by Major League Baseball. Kalish tracked the impact on customer acquisition in real time. The cost to acquire a new user dropped measurably in the weeks following the announcement. Not because the product had changed, not because the pricing had changed, not because the user experience had improved. The product was identical on April 14th and April 15th. The only variable that had changed was the perception of legitimacy. And the change in perception produced a change in behavior that Kalish could measure with the same tools he used to track every other aspect of the acquisition funnel. The insight was significant. The product's value to users was partly a function of what users believed about the product's institutional standing. $1 wagered on a platform endorsed by MLB carried a different psychological weight than $1 wagered on a platform endorsed by no one. The wager was identical, the odds were identical, the rake was identical, But the user's willingness to make the wager was not identical, because willingness was a function not only of expected value, but of trust, and trust was a function not only of the product's quality, but of the company the product kept. Robbins filed the insight in the same analytical framework where he filed everything, as a variable to be optimized. If institutional endorsement reduced customer acquisition costs, then institutional endorsement was a customer acquisition strategy. If league partnerships increased user trust, then league partnerships were trust engineering. The logic was clean and the math was sound. The question of what it meant for a professional sports league to lend its credibility to a platform where fans wagered real money on player performance, and whether that endorsement carried obligations beyond the financial terms of the investment agreement, was a question that no one at DraftKings or at Major League Baseball engaged with in April 2013. The question would arrive later. The answer would cost more than anyone had budgeted. The months following the MLB investment produced the first sustained acceleration in DraftKings' growth trajectory. The company had spent its first year proving that the product worked. It had spent the early months of 2013 proving that the product could attract users beyond the core demographic of hardcore fantasy statistics enthusiasts. The MLB endorsement proved something different, that the product could attract institutional capital, which was the prerequisite for attracting the volume of venture capital needed to compete at scale. The competitive landscape in 2013 was dominated by a single fact: FanDuel was ahead. The New York-based company had entered the market 2 years before DraftKings, had raised more capital, had more users, and had established itself as the default name in daily fantasy sports. When industry analysts described the DFS market, they described a market that FanDuel owned and that a handful of smaller operators, DraftKings among them, were attempting to enter. The word duopoly had not yet entered the vocabulary. In 2013, the market was a monopoly with aspirants. Robbins and Kalish approached the competitive gap with the same analytical framework they applied to everything, as a problem with a quantifiable solution. FanDuel had more users, FanDuel had more capital, FanDuel had more brand recognition. Each advantage could be expressed as a number, and each number could be targeted by a strategy designed to close the distance. The strategies were not complicated, they were expensive. Customer acquisition in the DFS market of 2013 operated according to a simple equation. The platform that spent more on promotions attracted more users, and the platform that attracted more users generated more rake, and the rake funded additional promotional spending. The cycle was self-reinforcing for the leader and punishing for the follower, because the leader's larger user base produced larger prize pools, and larger prize pools attracted additional users who wanted to compete for larger prizes, and the network effect compounded with each cycle. To break into FanDuel's lead, DraftKings needed to spend more than its revenue could support, which meant it needed external capital, which meant it needed to raise a venture round larger than anything the company had secured to date. The MLB investment made that round possible. In 2014, DraftKings closed its Series C funding at $41 million. The round was led by a group of venture capital firms whose participation reflected the shift in institutional perception that the MLB endorsement had catalyzed. A year earlier, DFS had been a regulatory question mark. Now it was a category with league endorsement, growing user metrics, and a competitive dynamic that venture capitalists recognized from other technology markets. Two platforms fighting for dominance in a winner-take-most category where scale advantages compounded over time. The $41 million entered the company's accounts and exited them with a velocity that reflected the competitive urgency of the moment. Kalish deployed the capital into a marketing operation that bore no resemblance to the message board advertisements and social media campaigns of the company's first year. Television advertising, radio spots, digital campaigns running across sports media properties, sponsorship deals with sports media personalities, promotional offers designed to convert curious visitors into depositing users, free contests, deposit matches, guaranteed prize pools large enough to generate their own media coverage. The promotional architecture was built on a principle that Kalish had refined during his year of tracking every dollar of acquisition cost. The first deposit was the critical conversion event. A user who visited the site, created an account, and browsed the contest listings was a prospect. A user who deposited money was a customer. The gap between prospect and customer was the gap between interest and commitment, and every element of the promotional strategy was designed to close that gap by reducing the perceived risk of the first deposit. Free contests eliminated the risk entirely. Deposit matches halved it. Guaranteed prize pools reframed the calculus from, I might lose my entry fee, to, someone is going to win $100,000 and it might be me. The math behind the promotional spending was straightforward. If the average customer generated $90 in annual rake revenue and the cost to acquire that customer was $60, the payback period was 8 months, and the lifetime value was a multiple of the acquisition cost. As long as the ratio held, every dollar of promotional spending was an investment with a positive expected return. The ratio held. The spending increased. The user base grew. And with every new user, the database grew alongside it. The database was not a product. It was not listed on the company's website. It was not mentioned in marketing materials or press releases or investor presentations, at least not in the terms that would later define its significance. In 2013 and 2014, the database was infrastructure. It was the unglamorous back-end system that stored user accounts, contest entries, deposit histories, bet types, login patterns, and the accumulating record of every decision every user made on the platform. But the database was also something else, something that Robbins recognized before most of his competitors and before most of his investors. The database was a census. Every user who created an account provided, at minimum, a name, an email address, a date of birth, and a payment method. Every user who deposited money provided a financial transaction history. Every user who entered a contest provided a record of their preferences, which sports they played, which contest types they favored, what entry fees they were willing to pay, how often they played, and at what times of day. Every user who logged in regularly provided a behavioral profile, session frequency, session duration, the ratio of contests entered to contests available, the pattern of deposits and withdrawals over time. In aggregate, the database contained the behavioral fingerprint of a growing population of sports-obsessed Americans who had demonstrated, through the act of depositing real money into a real money gaming platform, a willingness to wager on sports outcomes. This population was self-selected, it was pre-qualified, and it was growing at a rate that would, by the end of 2014, produce a database of hundreds of thousands of users whose behavioral profiles could be analyzed, segmented, and targeted with a precision that traditional media advertising could not approach. Robbins did not describe the database in these terms in 2013. The vocabulary of behavioral targeting and customer lifetime value optimization and warm acquisition funnel would enter the company's lexicon later, as the technology matured and the applications became visible. In 2013, the database was the record of who used the product and how they used it. The analysis was basic. Which contests attracted the most entries? Which promotional offers generated the most deposits? Which users returned most frequently, and which users churned after a single session? The insights were tactical, not strategic. They informed decisions about contest scheduling, promotional offer design, and customer service priorities. But the database was accumulating. Every day, every contest, every deposit, every login added rows to the tables. The users did not know they were building a database. They were playing fantasy sports. They were competing against friends, testing their knowledge of baseball statistics, spending $5 on a Tuesday night contest, and checking the results before bed. The experience was recreational. The data was institutional, and the institutional value of the data would in time exceed the recreational value of the product that generated it. The database that DraftKings built between 2012 and 2014 would later serve as the foundation for the company's transition into sports betting. When the Supreme Court overturned the federal ban on sports betting in May 2018, DraftKings would possess a list of millions of sports fans who had already demonstrated a willingness to wager real money on sports outcomes through a digital platform. Converting those users from fantasy players into sports bettors would cost a fraction of what it would cost to acquire them from scratch. The warm acquisition funnel, as the company would later describe it, would give DraftKings a structural advantage over traditional casino operators whose customer databases consisted of slot machine players and table game customers rather than sports-obsessed millennials with smartphones and deposit histories. None of this was visible in 2013. The sports betting market did not exist. The Supreme Court had not acted. The database was a byproduct of the product, not the product itself. But the byproduct was growing, and the growth was compounding, and the compound growth was building an asset whose value would not become apparent until the regulatory landscape shifted in a direction that no one in 2013 could predict with certainty, and that everyone in 2013 could sense was approaching. The DraftStreet acquisition closed in the summer of 2014. DraftStreet, a New York-based DFS platform, was the third largest operator in the market, behind FanDuel and DraftKings, with a user base that represented a meaningful but not dominant share of the category. The acquisition price has not been publicly disclosed, but the strategic value was clear. DraftStreet's users were absorbed into DraftKings' platform, increasing DraftKings' user base by approximately 50%. The acquisition accomplished two things simultaneously. It eliminated a competitor and added the competitor's users to DraftKings' database. The DFS market, which had contained a handful of operators as recently as 2013, was now a two-company race: FanDuel and DraftKings. The duopoly had formed. The formation of the duopoly was not an accident. It was the structural outcome of a market in which scale advantages compounded faster than smaller operators could grow. The larger your user base, the larger your prize pools. The larger your prize pools, the more users you attracted. The more users you attracted, the more data you accumulated. The more data you accumulated, the more precisely you could target promotional spending. The more precisely you targeted promotional spending, the lower your acquisition costs. The cycle fed itself, and the companies at the top of the cycle pulled further ahead with each revolution. For users on the outside of the duopoly, the consolidation was invisible. They saw two platforms offering similar products with similar interfaces and similar prize structures. They chose one, or they played on both, and the competition between the two ensured that promotional offers remained generous and prize pools remained large. The duopoly was, from the user's perspective, indistinguishable from a competitive market. For operators outside the duopoly, the consolidation was existential. The third largest DFS platform had been absorbed. The fourth and fifth were struggling for oxygen. The venture capital that fueled the growth cycle was flowing overwhelmingly to DraftKings and FanDuel, because investors recognized the winner-take-most dynamics and allocated their capital accordingly. A third entrant would need to spend more than either incumbent to reach the scale where the cycle became self-sustaining, and the incumbent's head start made that spend prohibitively large. The market structure that would later define American online sports betting, two companies controlling nearly 80% of the market, was established not in 2018 when sports betting was legalized, but in 2014 when DraftStreet's users were migrated to DraftKings servers and the third option disappeared. By the end of 2014, DraftKings had paid out more than $50 million in prizes and was serving approximately 50,000 active daily users. The numbers were growing at a rate that the company's original projections, drafted in Lieberman's spare bedroom on a whiteboard mounted to the back of a door, had not contemplated. The $1.4 million seed round that had funded the first baseball season had given way to a $41 million Series C. The 12 employees who had occupied the Fenway Park office had become dozens, and the company was preparing to move again into the kind of commercial space that came with a lobby, a receptionist, and conference rooms that did not double as storage closets. The marketing spend in 2014 exceeded the company's total revenue from 2013. That ratio, spending more on growth than the business currently generated, was standard for venture-backed technology companies in the growth phase. The venture model assumed that current losses were investments in future market position and that the company that captured the most market share during the growth phase would generate the most profit during the mature phase. The math was familiar to anyone who had studied Amazon, Uber, or any of the other technology companies that had burned capital for years before reporting a profit. The math was also, in its own way, a wager. The company was betting that the market would continue to grow, that the regulatory environment would remain favorable, and that the revenue per user would remain stable as the user base expanded from thousands to millions. The bet was working, but the bet was also consuming. The capital that funded the growth was not the founders' money. It was venture capital, raised from institutional investors who expected a return, and the return they expected was not $41 million, it was $410 million, or $1 billion, or whatever number the exit would produce when the company went public or was acquired. The growth was not optional. It was obligatory. The machine had to keep growing because the people who had funded the machine expected growth, and the people who had funded the machine had the contractual authority to replace the people who ran the machine if the growth did not materialize. Robbins understood this dynamic. He had internalized it the way he internalized every other variable in the business, as a constraint to be managed, an input to the optimization function. The growth mandate was the cost of the capital that funded the growth. The capital was the cost of the competitive position that justified the valuation. The valuation was the cost of the investor expectations that demanded the growth. The circle was closed and the circle was accelerating, and the acceleration was the point. On a Thursday evening in the fall of 2014, after the office had emptied, Robbins sat at his desk and opened the internal dashboard that tracked the company's key metrics in real time. The dashboard had been built by Liberman's engineering team at Robbins' request, and it displayed, on a single screen, the numbers that define the company's health: active users, contest entries, deposits, withdrawals, revenue, promotional costs, customer acquisition costs, and the retention rates broken out by cohort, by sport, by contest type, and by deposit frequency. He scrolled through the numbers. The NFL season was 4 weeks old. The daily active user count was higher than at the same point the previous year. The deposit volume was higher. The contest entries were higher. Every trend line was moving in the direction that the Series C investors had expected when they wrote their checks. Below the operational metrics, in a section of the dashboard that Robbins had labeled behavioral segments, the data was organized differently. Users were grouped not by demographic category but by behavioral pattern: deposit frequency, session timing, contest type preference, win-loss ratio, promotional offer responsiveness. The segments were crude by the standards of what the company would later build. They used basic clustering algorithms and simple threshold rules rather than the machine learning models that would arrive years later. But they sorted the user base into groups whose behaviors were measurably different from one another, and the differences suggested that different users might respond to different interventions. The segment that held his attention on this particular evening was one he had labeled, in the shorthand of the dashboard's naming convention, high-frequency declining balance. The segment contained users who logged in daily, entered multiple contests per session, and whose account balances were trending downward over time. They deposited regularly, but they deposited more than they withdrew, and the gap between deposits and withdrawals was widening. The segment was small. It represented perhaps 4% of the active user base, but its members generated revenue at a rate disproportionate to their numbers. Their contest entry volume ran 3 to 4 times the platform average. Their deposit frequency was twice the average. Their average monthly spend exceeded the statistical norms for recreational spending on entertainment products. Robbins noted the segment's existence. He flagged it for Kalish's marketing team as a group that should receive retention-focused outreach, which, in the vocabulary of 2014, meant promotional offers designed to keep them engaged: a free contest entry, a deposit bonus, a guaranteed prize pool invitation. The interventions were generic, not personalized. The technology to deliver individualized offers based on behavioral profiles did not yet exist on the platform. The interventions were, in the framework of the time, customer retention strategies. They were the same strategies that any subscription business used to prevent churn among its most active users. The segment was not labeled problem gamblers, it was not labeled at-risk users, it was not labeled vulnerable. Those labels belonged to a vocabulary that the company would not adopt for years, and that the company would resist adopting even after the vocabulary became unavoidable. In 2014, the segment was a cohort in a retention dashboard. Its members were active users whose engagement was declining, and the business objective was to reverse the decline. The promotional offers went out. Some users responded, some did not. The ones who responded deposited additional funds, entered additional contests, and generated additional revenue. The dashboard updated, the numbers moved. Robbins closed the laptop and left the office. The segment remained in the database, its behavioral pattern recorded, its members identifiable by the clustering algorithm's classification code. The classification was primitive, it would be refined. The promotions were generic, they would be personalized. The retention strategy was manual, it would be automated. The 4% would in time become a category with a name, a targeting strategy, and an economic model that quantified its value to the company in terms of customer lifetime value, promotional ROI, and expected deposit probability calculated to the decimal. But that was years away. In 2014, the segment was a line on a dashboard reviewed by a CEO who was building a company. The company was growing. The growth was the thing that mattered. The database noted the pattern. The database did not judge it. The database was patient. It had time. Chapter 3: The Blitz. On the first Sunday of the 2015 NFL season, a viewer in Phoenix, Arizona, turned on the television to watch the Cardinals play the New Orleans Saints. The game kicked off at 1:25 p.m. Mountain Time. Between kickoff and the final whistle, the viewer was exposed to DraftKings or FanDuel advertising during 11 of the 14 commercial breaks. The advertisements ran in 30-second and 60-second formats. They featured ordinary-looking men holding oversized checks. They featured countdown clocks and scrolling dollar amounts. They featured the phrase "free entry" in a font large enough to read from across the room, and the phrase "no purchase necessary" in a font that required the viewer to lean forward and squint. By the fourth quarter, the viewer could recite the promotional offers from memory: a $2 million prize pool, a $1 million first-place payout, a risk-free first deposit, entry fees as low as $1. Play now. Win big. Draft your team tonight. The viewer in Phoenix was one of approximately 23 million Americans who watched NFL football on that Sunday. Across all NFL broadcasts during September 2015, DraftKings and FanDuel advertisements aired an estimated 40,000 times. The combined advertising spend for the two companies during the third quarter of 2015 exceeded $200 million. For the full year, the figure approached $800 million, a sum that exceeded the combined marketing budgets of every casino operator in Las Vegas and represented more money than either company had earned in total revenue since its founding. The money was not being spent to generate profit, it was being spent to generate users. The profit would come later, or so the venture capitalists funding the war believed. The immediate objective was market share, and market share in a two-company race was a zero-sum equation. Every user acquired by DraftKings was a user not acquired by FanDuel, and every user not acquired was a user ceded to the competition. The economics of the spending were irrational by any traditional measure of business efficiency. Customer acquisition costs during the peak of the advertising war averaged $600 per user. Customer lifetime value, based on the behavioral data the platforms had accumulated over the previous 3 years, averaged approximately $150 to $200. The math did not work. The companies were paying 3 to 4 times more to acquire each customer than that customer was expected to generate in revenue over the duration of the relationship. They spent the money anyway. The logic behind the spending was not the logic of a sustainable business. It was the logic of a land grab, a digital version of the Oklahoma land rush, in which two companies raced to plant their flags on every acre of available territory before the territory filled up. The available territory was the American sports fan. There were approximately 195 million of them, according to industry estimates. Of those, roughly 60 million played some form of fantasy sports. Of those 60 million, fewer than 5 million had tried daily fantasy. The gap between 5 million and 60 million represented, in the vocabulary of venture capital, total addressable market. The gap was the opportunity. The spending was the vehicle for closing the gap. And the company that closed the gap fastest would own the relationship with the customer, the behavioral data that relationship generated, and the future revenue streams that the data would eventually unlock. The future revenue streams were the key to the math. DraftKings was not spending $600 to acquire a customer who would generate $150 in DFS revenue. DraftKings was spending $600 to acquire a data record. The data record would contain a name, a payment method, a deposit history, a behavioral profile, and a demonstrated willingness to wager real money on the outcome of sporting events. That data record, when the legal landscape changed, when sports betting was legalized, when new product verticals opened, would be worth far more than $150. The data record was an option on the future, and the option's value depended on a future that the founders were betting would arrive. They were not alone in this bet. The venture capital firms funding the advertising war shared the conviction. In 2015, DraftKings raised a $300 million Series E round that valued the company at over $2 billion. FanDuel raised comparable amounts at comparable valuations. The investors were not funding a daily fantasy sports company. They were funding a database of sports bettors who did not yet know they were sports bettors, warehoused in a product that the law called a game of skill, and that the customers called playing fantasy. Inside DraftKings' Boston headquarters, the spending was managed with a precision that belied its scale. Kalish's marketing operation had evolved from the lean, channel-specific campaigns of 2012 and 2013 into a multi-platform acquisition machine that processed millions of dollars in media buys per week across television, digital, radio, print, outdoor, social media, and partnership activations. The machine operated on a set of metrics that Kalish tracked on dashboards updated hourly. Cost per acquisition, CPA by channel, by geography, by time slot, by creative variant. Conversion rate from advertisement impression to app download. Conversion rate from app download to account creation. Conversion rate from account creation to first deposit. Conversion rate from first deposit to second contest entry. Each conversion was a step in the funnel, and each step had a dropout rate that Kalish's team labored to reduce by fractions of a percentage point, because a fraction of a percentage point multiplied across millions of impressions represented thousands of additional users and hundreds of thousands of additional dollars in deposits. The funnel was the machine's architecture. The promotional offers were its fuel. The offers followed a template refined across hundreds of iterations. New users received a deposit match, or a free entry offer, calibrated to reduce the psychological friction of the first deposit. The deposit match was the primary tool. Deposit $100, receive $100 in bonus credits. The bonus credits were not withdrawable. They could only be used to enter contests, and they had to be wagered a specified number of times before any associated winnings could be withdrawn. The wagering requirement was disclosed in the terms of service. The terms of service were accessible through a hyperlink at the bottom of the promotional landing page. The hyperlink was formatted in the same color as the background, rendering it visible to any user who looked for it and invisible to any user who did not. The deposit match served two functions. The first was acquisition. The offer reduced the perceived risk of the first deposit by promising the user that their money would be doubled. The second was behavioral. The wagering requirement ensured that the user would play multiple contests before any withdrawal was possible, generating multiple sessions, multiple behavioral data points, and multiple opportunities for the retention engine to identify the user's patterns and preferences. A user who deposited $100 to receive a $100 match and then wagered the combined $200 across 10 contests over 3 weeks was not merely a customer. The user was a behavioral profile in formation, a data record being populated with the inputs the system needed to predict future behavior. The system was learning to predict at scale. The promotional engine tracked not only which users responded to which offers, but when they responded, how quickly, at what dollar amounts, and what they did after responding. A user who deposited within 2 hours of receiving a promotional email was classified differently from a user who deposited after 3 days. A user who entered a single contest after depositing was classified differently from a user who entered 6. The classifications fed models that segmented the user base into cohorts: high engagement, medium engagement, at risk, dormant, churned. Each cohort received different promotional treatments. High engagement users received cross-sport offers designed to extend their activity into new seasons. At-risk users received reactivation offers with escalating dollar amounts. Dormant users received "We Miss You" emails with free contest entries attached. The segmentation was crude by the standards of what the system would later become. The models ran on batch processing, updated weekly or bi-weekly, rather than in real time. The promotional offers were generated by human marketers working from segment-level playbooks, not by algorithms calibrating individual interventions. But the infrastructure was being assembled. Each campaign generated data. Each dataset refined the segments. Each refinement made the next campaign more precise. The machine was teaching itself, one batch cycle at a time, how to identify, acquire, retain, and reactivate users at a scale that no human marketing team could manage manually. The advertising itself was a production operation. DraftKings' creative team in Boston produced hundreds of distinct advertisement variants per quarter, each one tested against control groups before deployment at scale. The variants differed in cast. Young men in their 20s performed better than mixed age groups. In setting, living rooms outperformed bars by 11% in click-through rate. In music, up-tempo tracks outperformed neutral tracks, and in the specific dollar amounts featured in the promotional offer. A television spot that featured a $1 million prize pool generated a measurably different response rate than a spot that featured a $2 million prize pool, and the difference was not proportional to the size increase. The creative team tracked these differentials with the granularity of a pharmaceutical trial measuring dosage response curves. The partnership strategy ran in parallel with the advertising campaign. By mid-2015, DraftKings had secured promotional agreements with the NFL, MLB, the NHL, the NBA, and Major League Soccer. The agreements varied in structure. Some involved equity investments, some involved revenue-sharing arrangements. Some involved advertising placement during league-controlled broadcasts. All of them involved the league's logos appearing alongside DraftKings' brand in promotional materials, and all of them reinforced the same message that the MLB investment had delivered in 2013. If the leagues themselves were partnering with DraftKings, the product was legitimate. The NFL's relationship with DraftKings was the most consequential and the most contradictory. The league had spent decades opposing sports gambling with institutional fervor. Commissioner Roger Goodell had testified before Congress that sports betting posed a threat to the integrity of the game. The league had suspended players for gambling. It had lobbied for the federal ban that PASPA represented. And in 2015, the NFL accepted DraftKings as an official sponsor, allowed its logo to appear in DraftKings advertisements aired during NFL broadcasts, and collected sponsorship revenue from a company whose product allowed users to wager real money on the performance of NFL players in NFL games. The NFL's stated position was that daily fantasy sports was not gambling. The stated position was consistent with the UEGA's fantasy sports exemption. The stated position was also the position that allowed the NFL to collect sponsorship revenue from an industry whose economic substance was identical to the activity the NFL claimed to oppose. The league maintained both positions simultaneously. Neither position was articulated in proximity to the other. The advertising blitz did not merely sell a product to sports fans. It altered what it meant to be a sports fan. Before 2015, The American sports viewing experience was organized around allegiance. A viewer watched a game because the viewer's team was playing. The emotional investment was in the outcome. A win produced satisfaction, a loss produced disappointment, and the accumulation of wins and losses across a season produced the narrative arc that made fandom a form of belonging. The box score was a record of athletic performance. The statistics measured what athletes did on the field. The viewer's relationship to those statistics was mediated by loyalty. A touchdown mattered because the viewer's team scored it. A strikeout mattered because the viewer's pitcher threw it. The DFS advertisements introduced a different relationship. In the DraftKings commercial, the viewer was not a fan. The viewer was a player. The viewer selected athletes from any team, assembled a roster governed by a salary cap, and won or lost money based on those athletes' individual statistical output. A touchdown mattered not because a team scored it, but because the viewer had selected the player who scored it and had paid $7,200 of a $50,000 salary cap for the privilege. A strikeout mattered not because a team's pitcher threw it, but because the viewer owned that pitcher in 3 separate contests at a combined entry fee of $45. The shift was fundamental, and the advertisements accelerated it. The box score was no longer a record of athletic achievement. It was a financial statement. The statistics were no longer measurements of performance. They were price movements in a portfolio the viewer had assembled that morning. The game itself was no longer the point. The game was the mechanism by which the viewer's money either grew or disappeared. A blowout between 2 teams the viewer did not care about was no longer unwatchable. It was unwatchable only if the viewer had no financial exposure to the players on the field. If the viewer had selected the running back in the fourth quarter of a 30-point game, the fourth quarter was riveting because the running back's garbage time carries were adding rushing yards to a prop that the viewer needed to hit 87 to complete a 3-leg accumulator whose potential payout was $312. The transformation was visible in the living rooms where the games were consumed. A sports bar in Dallas during the 2015 NFL season contained, by the testimony of bartenders and managers quoted in sports media reporting during the period, a population increasingly divided between 2 species of viewer. The first species cheered when the Cowboys scored. The second species stared at phones, refreshing DraftKings or FanDuel contest pages, calculating whether a Cowboys touchdown helped or hurt a portfolio that included an Eagles wide receiver, a Saints quarterback, and a Panthers defense. The first species left when the Cowboys lost. The second species stayed because the second species had financial positions in the late afternoon games, and the late afternoon games contained players whose statistics were still moving. The bar stayed full longer. The televisions stayed on later. The beer tabs were higher. The bar owners did not complain. The bar owners could not distinguish from behind the counter between a customer whose engagement was driven by loyalty and a customer whose engagement was driven by a deposit. The industry's own data confirmed the transformation. DFS users watched 40% more live sports programming than non-DFS users. They watched games involving teams they had no geographic or emotional connection to. They watched games that would have been irrelevant to them without a financial position in the outcome. The additional viewership was the selling point that DraftKings used to court the leagues. DFS makes fans watch more games. The selling point was accurate. What it did not say was that the additional viewership was driven not by increased fandom but by increased financial exposure, and that the conversion of a fan into a player was not a deepening of the sports viewing experience, but a replacement of one experience with another. The fan watched the game to see the team win. The player watched the game to see the numbers move. The distinction mattered because it determined the viewer's relationship to risk. A fan who sat through a losing game lost an evening's emotional investment. A player who sat through a losing game lost money. The emotional cost of fandom was self-limiting. A bad season was disappointing but did not produce financial harm. The financial cost of daily fantasy was not self-limiting. A bad week could be recovered by depositing more money and entering more contests, and the immediacy of the daily format meant that the next opportunity to recover was always one day away. The fans' relationship to the sport was bounded by the season. The players' relationship to the sport was bounded by the balance in the account. DraftKings advertising did not announce this transformation. It enacted it. Each advertisement that featured a prize amount rather than a team name, a payout rather than a score, a roster construction rather than a game highlight, trained the viewer to process sports through a financial lens. The training was repetitive. 11 commercial breaks per game, 40,000 advertisement airings per month across every broadcast window in the American sports calendar. The repetition was the pedagogy. The viewer did not decide to become a player. The viewer was converted, one advertisement at a time, into a person for whom the phrase, "I have $7,200 on the Cowboys running back in the second half," was a normal sentence to speak in a living room on a Sunday afternoon. The advertisements did not describe this dynamic. They described winning, the oversized checks, the million-dollar prizes, the free entries, the risk-free deposits. The advertisements were not false. Users did win large prizes. The contests were real. The money was real. What the advertisements omitted was the mathematical structure beneath the prizes. For every dollar paid out, the platform retained approximately 10 cents in rake, and the remaining 90 cents was redistributed among participants in a distribution that, according to independent analysis of DFS contest results, concentrated winnings among a small percentage of high-volume, high-skill players, while the majority of participants experienced net losses over any extended period of play. The concentration was measurable. Industry researchers who analyzed public DFS contest results during 2015 found that approximately 1.3% of users accounted for the majority of winnings across major contest formats. These users, colloquially known as sharks or grinders, entered hundreds of contests per day using lineup optimization software, statistical models, and ownership percentage data that gave them structural advantages over casual participants. The casual participant, the viewer in Phoenix who entered a $5 NFL contest because the advertisement during the Cardinals game promised it was free, was competing against professionals whose analytical infrastructure exceeded that of many financial trading operations. The platform's rules permitted this competition. DraftKings did not restrict the number of contests a single user could enter. It did not restrict the use of lineup optimization software. It did not disclose to casual users the percentage of their contest pool that consisted of professional-grade participants. The information asymmetry was structural. The professionals had data, tools, and volume that the casual user did not. The professionals won more often. The casual users funded the prize pools from which the professionals drew their winnings. The platform collected its rake regardless of who won. The advertising war between DraftKings and FanDuel was not conducted in isolation. It was conducted against each other, in real time, with competitive intelligence operations that monitored the rivals' every media buy, every promotional campaign, every partnership announcement. Inside DraftKings, the competitive response operation tracked FanDuel's advertising purchases at the level of individual television time slots. When FanDuel purchased a 30-second spot during Sunday Night Football, DraftKings' media buying team received an alert within hours and was directed to match or exceed the placement in the following week's inventory. When FanDuel launched a $2 million fantasy football championship promotion, DraftKings responded within 90 minutes with a $2.5 million Millionaire Maker contest whose prize pool exceeded FanDuel's by exactly enough to dominate the comparison in promotional copy. When FanDuel purchased billboard space along the Massachusetts Turnpike, DraftKings purchased the billboard adjacent to it. The escalation was reflexive, calibrated, and mathematically inevitable. The response times were tracked. Internal records from the period documented an average of 2.3 hours from detection of a FanDuel promotional campaign to deployment of a DraftKings counteroffer. The speed required a decision-making framework that bypassed traditional approval hierarchies. Kalish's marketing team had pre-authorized spending thresholds that allowed media buyers to commit budget in response to competitive moves without waiting for executive sign-off. The pre-authorization was itself a competitive weapon. FanDuel's approval process was slower, which meant that DraftKings could often launch a counter-promotion before FanDuel had finished evaluating the impact of its own initial campaign. The competitive intelligence extended beyond advertising into user behavior. Both companies monitored each other's promotional offer structures through test accounts, publicly available contest listings, and user reports submitted by customers who maintained accounts on both platforms. Approximately 40% of active DFS users maintained accounts on both DraftKings and FanDuel, meaning that both companies were spending hundreds of millions of dollars to acquire and retain users who were simultaneously being acquired and retained by the competition. The shared user base created a peculiar dynamic. Each company's promotional offers were evaluated by the user, not in absolute terms, but in comparison to the rival's most recent offer. A $100 deposit match from DraftKings was generous only until FanDuel offered a $200 deposit match the following week. The offers escalated because the offers were relative, and relative offers in a two-company market have only one direction. The escalation followed the mathematics of competitive warfare. Each company's spending was rational only in relation to the other company's spending, and neither company could reduce its spending without ceding market share to the rival. The equilibrium was mutual destruction funded by venture capital. Both companies understood that the spending was unsustainable. Both companies continued spending because the alternative, ceding the market to the competitor, was worse than the cost of maintaining position. The venture capital firms funding both sides of the war understood the dynamic and funded it anyway, on the theory that the market would eventually consolidate into one winner whose database of users, behavioral data, and brand equity would justify the cumulative investment. The theory required one of two outcomes. Either the companies would merge, combining their user bases and eliminating the competitive spending, or one company would exhaust its capital first, leaving the survivor in possession of the market. Both outcomes required patience. Both outcomes required continued funding. Both outcomes required the legal foundation on which the industry rested to remain intact long enough for the consolidation to occur. The legal foundation was, at that moment, beginning to crack. The crack had a name, though nobody in the Boston headquarters or the New York headquarters would learn it for several more months. In September 2015, a DraftKings employee named Ethan Haskell won approximately $350,000 in a single week playing contests on FanDuel. The winnings attracted attention because they coincided with the release on the DraftKings platform of ownership percentage data that was not available to ordinary users until after the contests had closed. The implication was inescapable. A DraftKings employee had access to data about how many users had selected specific players in DraftKings contests, and that data, applied to FanDuel contests where the information was not yet public, conferred an informational advantage equivalent to insider trading in financial markets. The incident had not yet become public as the September advertising blitz peaked. The crack in the foundation was forming below the surface, invisible to the 23 million viewers watching NFL football and the marketing teams buying the commercial time and the venture capitalists funding the media buys. The crack would become visible in October when the story broke in the New York Times, and the visibility would trigger a chain of events that would bring attorneys general, congressional investigators, and federal regulators to the door of an industry that had spent 3 years and nearly $1 billion convincing the American public that what it offered was not gambling. But on the first Sunday of September 2015, the crack was silent. The advertisements ran, the viewers watched, the deposits flowed, and somewhere in the database, among the millions of behavioral records accumulating with each contest and each deposit and each session, a pattern was forming that the system's own metrics would later flag. A user in a mid-sized Midwestern city had created an account during the first week of the NFL season, drawn by a television advertisement offering a free contest entry. He was 31 years old, married, employed as an electrician, and had played season-long fantasy football since college. The free entry required an account creation, which required a deposit method on file, which required a debit card number. The debit card was linked to the checking account he shared with his wife. He entered the free contest. He lost. He entered a paid contest the following day, a $5 entry fee, and won $14. The win produced a response that the platform's retention models would later categorize as a positive reinforcement event, an early win that established a pattern of continued engagement disproportionate to the win's dollar amount. He played 4 contests in his first week. He played 11 in his second. His entry fees averaged $7, and his cumulative spend through 2 weeks was $105. His cumulative winnings were $62. He was $43 behind, a figure he did not calculate because the platform's interface displayed his available balance, $19, without contextualizing it against his total deposits. He deposited another $50. The available balance read $69. The number was sufficient. The contest continued. His wife's name was Karen. She taught 3rd grade at a public school 12 minutes from their house. They had been married for 4 years. They did not share a DraftKings account. They shared a checking account, and the checking account registered his deposits as line items labeled DK, followed by a transaction code. Karen did not follow fantasy sports. She did not recognize the abbreviation. She did not ask about the charges because the individual amounts were small, $5 here, $10 there, and the checking account balance fluctuated with enough routine variability from gas purchases, grocery runs, and utility payments that an additional $50 in weekly outflow did not surface as an anomaly. The charges were hiding in plain sight, camouflaged by their own insignificance. By the end of September, his total deposits were $340. His total withdrawals were 0. His available balance was $28. The net loss of $312 was distributed across 47 contests over 26 days, an average loss of $6.64 per contest, an amount so small per occurrence that it registered as insignificant against each individual entry fee, but accumulated over the pace of daily play, into a sum that exceeded his monthly budget for discretionary spending by a factor of 3. He did not tell his wife. The debit card transactions appeared on the joint statement as DK, followed by a string of numbers, and his wife, who did not follow fantasy sports and did not recognize the abbreviation, did not ask about them. The platform did not contact him to inform him that his spending pattern exceeded typical recreational parameters. The platform's responsible gaming tools were available in the account settings. The tools included deposit limits, session time reminders, and a self-exclusion option. The user had not activated any of them because activating them required navigating to a page whose existence was not surfaced during the normal flow of contest entry, roster construction, or deposit processing. The system logged his sessions. It classified his engagement as high frequency. It included him in the cohort that received promotional offers designed to maintain activity during periods of declining balance. He received, during the last week of September, an email offering a $25 bonus credit for a $50 deposit. The bonus required a wagering minimum before withdrawal. He deposited $50. He played the bonus through 6 contests. His balance returned to $12. He was a data point in a database that had grown to encompass millions of records. His pattern was not unique. It was a cluster, a segment, a behavioral signature shared by some percentage of the user base whose magnitude the company would not publicly disclose and whose characteristics the company would not publicly define until compelled to do so by litigation and regulatory investigation. In September 2015, the pattern was a line on a dashboard. The line was trending in a direction that generated revenue. Revenue was the metric that mattered. The advertising blitz was working. The users were arriving. The deposits were flowing. The database was deepening. The machine was running at full capacity, consuming venture capital as fuel and converting it into users, data, and market share. The fuel would not last forever. The legal foundation beneath the machine was about to be tested. The crack in the foundation, the DraftKings employee's $350,000 windfall on a competing platform, was about to become the most consequential news story in the short history of daily fantasy sports. But the machine did not know that. The machine processed data, not consequences. It measured deposits, not outcomes. It optimized acquisition, not responsibility. The advertisements aired, the viewers tuned in, the deposits flowed, the database learned. Chapter 4, The Insider Part 2, The Crucible, 2015-2018. On the morning of Saturday, October 3rd, 2015, a high school football coach in suburban New Jersey opened the DraftKings app on his phone, deposited $200, and entered 4 NFL contests at a combined entry fee of $175. The coach's name does not appear in any regulatory filing or court document. He was not a professional daily fantasy player. He was a 41-year-old man who had played season-long fantasy football since his college years at Rutgers, who had downloaded DraftKings during the advertising blitz of September 2015, and who had, over the preceding 3 weeks, developed the habit of constructing his DFS rosters on Saturday mornings, while his daughters ate cereal in the next room, and his wife reviewed the weekend schedule on a whiteboard mounted to the kitchen wall. He built his rosters the way most recreational users built theirs, with a combination of knowledge, intuition, and the information available through the platform's player cards and publicly accessible statistical databases. The quarterbacks with favorable matchups were identifiable through the same injury reports the NFL published on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of each week. He read the analysis columns on DraftKings' own editorial blog, which published player projections, salary cap advice, and ownership percentage estimates that its writers compiled through a blend of survey data and professional judgment. The ownership percentage estimates were the critical variable. In large field DFS tournaments, where thousands of users competed for a shared prize pool, the optimal strategy depended not only on selecting the highest performing players, but on selecting players whom other users had not selected. A player who scored 30 fantasy points was valuable. A player who scored 30 fantasy points while appearing on fewer than 5% of competing rosters was worth far more, because the scarcity of his selection amplified the scoring advantage across a field where most competitors did not benefit from his performance. The concept was called leverage, and it was the strategic mechanism that separated professionals from recreationals. The mathematics of leverage were precise. In a tournament of 10,000 entries, a player selected by 40% of the field appeared on 4,000 rosters. If that player scored well, 4,000 rosters benefited. The advantage was shared so widely that it provided minimal differentiation. A player selected by 3% of the field appeared on 300 rosters. If that player scored equally well, 300 rosters benefited while 9,700 did not. The 300 rosters that contained the low ownership player gained a scoring advantage over 97% of the field. The advantage was structural, mathematical, and available to anyone who could estimate ownership percentages with accuracy. Accuracy was the problem. The professionals devoted substantial resources to estimating ownership percentages before contests locked. They surveyed expert opinion, analyzed historical selection patterns, modeled the relationship between salary cap price and expected ownership, and combined multiple estimation methods into composite projections whose precision exceeded casual intuition by significant margins. The recreationals relied on the estimates published in editorial content, on personal judgment, and on the assumption that the information available to them was the same information available to everyone. The assumption was wrong. On the afternoon of Friday, October 2nd, 2015, a DraftKings content manager named Ethan Haskell was producing editorial material for the company's blog. The work was routine. Haskell's role involved compiling player analysis, statistical projections, and ownership percentage data into articles designed to help users construct competitive rosters for the upcoming NFL slate. The ownership percentage data he accessed was proprietary. It was derived from the actual rosters that DraftKings users had submitted for the weekend's contests. It showed, with precision unavailable through any external source, exactly which players were appearing on the highest percentage of submitted rosters and which players were appearing on the lowest. This data was the most valuable competitive intelligence in daily fantasy sports. A user who possessed precise ownership percentages before contest lock could construct rosters optimized for leverage with a degree of accuracy that no public estimate could match. The user could identify the exact players whose low ownership would maximize differential scoring. The user could avoid the exact players whose high ownership would minimize differential advantage even in the event of strong performance. The data transformed roster construction from an exercise in projection to an exercise in precision. The difference between an estimated ownership percentage of around 15% and a known ownership percentage of 11.7% was the difference between a recreational guess and an institutional advantage. Haskell possessed this data as a function of his job. He accessed it to write blog posts. The blog posts he published contained sanitized analysis derived from the data, not the data itself. The raw ownership percentages were proprietary. They were not intended for public distribution. On Friday, October 2nd, Haskell made an error. During the production of a blog post, he accidentally included raw ownership percentage data in the published content. The data was live on the DraftKings website for approximately 18 minutes before the error was identified and the post was corrected. The 18-minute window was sufficient for the information to be captured by users who monitored DraftKings editorial content for competitive intelligence. The information was shared on DFS forums analyzed by professional players and archived by individuals who recognized its value. Haskell also maintained an active account on FanDuel, DraftKings' primary competitor. Account records produced during subsequent federal investigation documented that his FanDuel contest activity increased during the weekend of October 3 to 4. His entry fees totaled several $1,000s across multiple tournaments. His lineup construction, analyzed by federal investigators and independent researchers after the fact, demonstrated a pattern consistent with contrarian strategies optimized for leverage. Player selections focused on low ownership alternatives whose projected performance exceeded their salary cap cost relative to popular choices. The strategies incorporated correlation effects and variance management techniques typically associated with professional-grade analytical infrastructure. His results exceeded statistical expectations for recreational participants by a margin that attracted attention before any public connection to the data leak had been established. Professional DFS players who monitored unusual outcomes identified Haskell's performance during the weekend and posted analysis on forums questioning the information sources that could produce such specific and such consistently contrarian player selections. The online analysis was granular. It reverse-engineered his lineup construction and mapped the selections against the ownership percentage data that had been briefly published on the DraftKings blog 2 days earlier. The correlation was visible to anyone who looked. Banking records produced during the federal investigation documented total FanDuel winnings of approximately $350,000 across the October 3 to 4 weekend. The sum represented a substantial multiple of Haskell's annual salary as a DraftKings content manager. The New York Times published the story on October 5, 2015. The reporting connected the DraftKings data leak to Haskell's FanDuel contest performance and framed the incident in language that the industry had spent 3 years and nearly $1 billion in advertising trying to avoid: insider trading. The phrase was precise and devastating. In financial markets, insider trading occurs when a person trades securities based on material, non-public information. In daily fantasy sports, the equivalent occurred when a company employee used proprietary data about contest composition to construct rosters on a competing platform with an informational advantage unavailable to ordinary users. The legal frameworks governing the two activities were different. The economic logic was identical. A person with access to information that others did not possess used that information to generate profit at the expense of those who did not possess it. The Times reporting triggered a cascade that the industry's advertising budget was powerless to contain. The story was picked up by every major news outlet in the country. ESPN, which had entered a promotional partnership with DraftKings, covered the scandal on its programming, while its own network aired DraftKings advertisements during commercial breaks. The juxtaposition was visible to any viewer who paid attention. The editorial content questioned the integrity of daily fantasy sports, while the advertising content promised that daily fantasy sports was a fair game of skill. Congressional attention followed within days. Representative Frank Pallone Jr. of New Jersey, chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee, delivered prepared remarks during a recorded committee session that included mathematical analysis of Haskell's success rates. The numbers, Poloni argued, exceeded statistical probability for recreational participants by margins that indicated access to information unavailable through legitimate means. His conclusion, rendered in the congressional record, was blunt. When employees can use inside information to win hundreds of thousands of dollars, we're not talking about fantasy sports. We're talking about a rigged casino. The word casino landed on the industry with the force of a verdict. The Federal Bureau of Investigation opened an inquiry. The investigation's scope extended beyond Haskell's individual conduct to encompass industry-wide practices regarding employee oversight, data security, and the structural relationship between company employees and the contest pools in which those employees' customers competed. FBI agents interviewed DraftKings and FanDuel employees. They reviewed internal communications, data access logs, and training materials. They assessed whether the companies had maintained security protocols adequate to prevent the misuse of proprietary data by employees with access to information that could influence contest outcomes. The assessment was not favorable. Federal investigation records documented that neither DraftKings nor FanDuel had implemented training programs addressing the handling of proprietary contest data or the potential legal exposure associated with employee access to competitive intelligence. The companies had maintained what investigators characterized as casual policies regarding employee participation on competing platforms. Employees of both companies routinely played DFS contests on the rival's platform. The practice was not prohibited, it was not monitored, it was not subject to disclosure requirements or compliance review. The casual approach reflected the startup culture from which both companies had emerged. In the spare bedroom in Watertown, in the early office in Boston, the distinction between employee and user had been meaningless. The founders played their own product. The first engineers played their own product. The company's internal culture treated DFS participation as a demonstration of engagement, not a conflict of interest. As the companies grew, as the contest pools expanded into the millions of dollars, as the proprietary data accumulated in databases accessible to dozens and then hundreds of employees, the casual policies persisted. The policies that were harmless when 3 founders played contests in a spare bedroom became hazardous when hundreds of employees had access to ownership percentage data in a company processing millions of dollars in daily contest entries. The hazard had materialized. The industry's response was reactive. Class action lawsuits were filed in multiple jurisdictions within weeks of the Times reporting. The plaintiffs alleged that both DraftKings and FanDuel had engaged in false advertising by promoting daily fantasy as recreational entertainment accessible to casual sports fans while possessing internal data demonstrating that market dynamics concentrated winnings among a small percentage of professional-grade participants. The complaints cited marketing materials that featured amateur winners holding oversized checks alongside internal analytics showing that the vast majority of participants lost money over any extended period of play. The gap between what the advertisements promised and what the data showed was, in the plaintiff's legal theory, a violation of consumer protection statutes in every state where the companies operated. The litigation exposed a second category of internal documentation, records showing that both companies possessed behavioral data capable of identifying users whose engagement patterns indicated escalating losses. The data existed. The companies used it to optimize promotional targeting and retention campaigns. They did not use it to identify users who might benefit from responsible gaming interventions. The distinction between using behavioral data to retain users and using behavioral data to protect users would become a central question in the regulatory proceedings that followed. On the morning of October 6th, the day after the Times story published, both DraftKings and FanDuel issued parallel announcements prohibiting employees from participating in daily fantasy contests on any platform. The prohibitions took effect that day. The prohibitions were framed as precautionary measures, not admissions of wrongdoing. The companies retained independent investigators to review internal data access policies and employee conduct. The investigations were described in press releases carefully drafted by corporate communications teams operating in crisis mode as evidence of the company's commitment to integrity and transparency. The language of the response was instructive. DraftKings' public statement emphasized that no evidence had been found to indicate that Haskell had used proprietary data to gain an advantage in the specific contests where he had won $350,000. The statement was technically defensible. The federal investigation had not yet reached a conclusion. The evidence was circumstantial. The data leak, the timing, the performance, the correlation. Circumstantial evidence was not proof. The company's legal position was that the temporal proximity of the data leak and the contest winnings did not establish a causal relationship. The public did not parse the distinction. The public heard DraftKings employee wins $350,000 using data his company possessed and ordinary users did not. The public processed the headline through the same frame it used for financial scandals. The House had cheated. The game was rigged. The promises of fairness that had saturated every commercial break of every NFL broadcast for the past month were at best incomplete and at worst false. Jason Robbins addressed the crisis in a series of media appearances during the first week of October. His statements were consistent, measured, and structured around two claims. First, that the Haskell incident was an isolated failure of individual judgment, not a systemic practice. And second, that DraftKings was committed to implementing enhanced data security protocols that would prevent similar incidents in the future. The claims were defensible. The incident may have been isolated. The protocols were, in fact, implemented. But the claims addressed the specific allegation without addressing the structural vulnerability that the allegation had exposed. The structural vulnerability was information asymmetry, not the specific asymmetry of the Haskell incident, where one employee possessed data that other users did not. The broader asymmetry that defined the relationship between the platform and its users. DraftKings possessed aggregate data about contest composition, user behavior, deposit patterns, and lineup construction that no individual user could access. The company used this data to optimize its product, calibrate its promotional offers, and manage its contest economics. The data was a corporate asset. Its existence was a structural feature of any platform that hosted contests among thousands of users. The question the Haskell scandal forced into public view was not whether a single employee had misused data. The question was whether a platform that possessed asymmetric information about the contests it hosted and the users who paid to enter them could credibly claim that those contests were fair. The question had no comfortable answer. The high school football coach in New Jersey lost $175 on October 3 to 4, 2015. The sum was not catastrophic. It was not life-altering. It was the cost of 4 DFS contests entered on a Saturday morning while his daughters ate cereal, settled by Sunday evening after the late afternoon NFL games concluded. The loss was within his recreational budget, if barely. He did not contact DraftKings to complain. He did not file a regulatory complaint. He did not join the class action lawsuits that were filed in multiple jurisdictions in the weeks following the scandal. He deposited another $50 the following Tuesday and entered 2 contests for the next NFL slate. He was not a victim of the Haskell incident in any specific provable sense. His contest entries may or may not have competed against rosters constructed with the benefit of proprietary ownership data. The contests he entered on October 3rd to 4th were hosted on DraftKings, not FanDuel, and Haskell's documented winnings occurred on FanDuel. The overlap between the leaked data and the specific contest the coach entered was, in all likelihood, 0. He was a victim of something else. He was a victim of the asymmetry, not the Haskell asymmetry, the specific and remediable failure of one employee's judgment, the permanent asymmetry. The structural condition in which a recreational user entered a contest against a field that included professional-grade participants whose analytical infrastructure exceeded his own by orders of magnitude. The 1.3% asymmetry, the figure that federal investigators would document in their review of industry practices. In the first half of 2015, approximately 1.3% of DFS users had won 91% of all prize money across both DraftKings and FanDuel. The statistic was not produced by the Haskell scandal. It was produced by the structure of the game. DFS contests pooled recreational users and professional users in the same fields, charged both the same entry fees, and distributed prizes from a shared pool. The professionals entered hundreds of contests per day using lineup optimization software that generated thousands of roster permutations, evaluated each permutation against statistical models trained on historical performance data, and selected the combinations most likely to produce top percentile outcomes in large field tournaments. The professionals treated DFS as a full-time occupation. Their analytical infrastructure included proprietary models, subscription data services, and collaboration networks that shared research and optimized strategies across pools of professional capital. The recreational user, the football coach, entering 4 contests on a Saturday morning, competed against this infrastructure with a phone, a player card, and the estimates published on a blog. The contest rules did not distinguish between the two. The entry fees were the same. The prize pool was shared. The professionals' lineup and the coaches' lineup occupied the same field, and the professionals' lineup was constructed with tools, data, and analytical precision that the coach did not possess, could not afford, and in many cases did not know existed. The platform's rules permitted this arrangement. DraftKings did not restrict the number of contests a single user could enter. It did not restrict the use of third-party optimization software. It did not segregate recreational users from professionals. It did not disclose to users entering a contest what percentage of that contest's field consisted of multi-entry professionals whose analytical infrastructure gave them structural advantages over single-entry recreational participants. A football coach entering a $25 NFL tournament on a Saturday morning had no way to determine, from the information displayed in the contest lobby, whether he was competing against 50 casual players or 500 optimized lineups submitted by 12 professional accounts. The information to answer that question existed. It existed in the same database that contained the ownership percentages Haskell had accidentally published. The platform possessed the data. The platform chose not to share it. The Haskell scandal did not destroy the daily fantasy sports industry. It did something more corrosive. It introduced doubt. Before October 5, 2015, the narrative surrounding DFS was controlled by the companies that operated it. The narrative was one of skill, fairness, and entertainment. The advertisements featured winners. The promotional copy promised a level playing field. The legal argument was that DFS was a game of skill, and skill implied fairness, and fairness implied that the outcome depended on the participants' effort and knowledge, not on asymmetric access to information or structural advantages invisible to casual users. After October 5th, the narrative was shared. The companies still told their story, but the New York Times told a different one. The congressional hearings told a different one. The FBI investigation told a different one. The 1.3% statistic told the most devastating story of all, that the game was, for the vast majority of participants, a wealth transfer mechanism that moved money from recreational users to professional users while the platform collected its rake from both. The cultural moment was visible in the media's treatment of its own DFS partnerships. ESPN, which had signed a multi-year promotional agreement with DraftKings worth a reported $250 million, found itself covering the Haskell scandal on its news programming while airing DraftKings advertisements during commercial breaks on the same network. The editorial division reported the story with the rigor the story demanded. The business division honored the advertising contract with the obligation the contract required. The two operations coexisted on the same broadcast signal, separated by the 3-second fade to commercial. A viewer who paid attention could watch an ESPN anchor question the integrity of daily fantasy sports, see a DraftKings advertisement promising $1 million in prizes this Sunday, and return to the anchor's coverage of the regulatory fallout, all within a single commercial break cycle. ESPN did not terminate its DraftKings partnership in October 2015. The partnership was too valuable. The scandal was too significant. Both facts persisted. The doubt was productive. It forced questions that the industry's advertising budget had successfully deferred for 3 years. If DFS was a game of skill, whose skill was being measured? If the field included professionals with access to optimization software, subscription data services, and collaborative research networks, was the skill being measured the recreational user's knowledge of football, or the professional's ability to deploy computational resources at scale? If 1. 3% of users won 91% of the money, was the product recreational entertainment, or was it a market in which a small number of informed participants extracted value from a large number of uninformed participants? A market whose economic structure was, in every functional respect, identical to the financial markets whose analogies the industry had spent 3 years denying. The questions were not editorial, they were structural. They emerged from the data the industry itself had generated. The 1.3% figure was not produced by a hostile regulator or an anti-gambling advocate. It was produced by the contest results that the platforms had processed and stored. The data was the argument. The argument did not require an adjective. The industry's defenders responded with counter-arguments that were, in isolation, defensible. Skill mattered. The law said so. The UIGA exempted fantasy sports. The contests were fair in the sense that every user had access to the same publicly available statistical information. The presence of professionals did not invalidate the contest any more than the presence of professional poker players invalidated a poker tournament open to amateurs. The counter-arguments did not address the doubt. They addressed the accusation. The accusation was that DFS was rigged. The counter-argument was that DFS was legal. The two claims occupied different planes. The industry could be legal and still be unfair. The contests could satisfy the UIGA's definition of skill and still concentrate winnings among a fraction of participants whose advantages were invisible to the majority. The law and the ethics were not the same question. The doubt persisted. It followed the industry through the fall of 2015 and into the winter, where it would meet a second crisis that made the Haskell scandal look like a prelude. In November, the Attorney General of New York would issue a cease and desist letter asserting that DraftKings contests were not games of skill at all. They were, in the Attorney General's legal judgment, illegal gambling. The letter would initiate a regulatory confrontation that would shut down paid DFS operations in the state of New York and trigger a nationwide re-examination of the legal distinction on which the entire industry rested. The crack in the foundation that had formed with the Haskell scandal was about to widen. The high school football coach in New Jersey continued playing through October. He deposited $200 on October 10th and entered 6 contests. He deposited $150 on October 17th and entered 4. His cumulative deposits since creating his account in September totaled $1,740. His cumulative withdrawals totaled $220. His net loss was $520, distributed across 63 contests over 6 weeks, an average loss of $24.13 per contest entry. He had read the New York Times article about Haskell. He had watched the ESPN segments about the insider trading allegations. He had seen Representative Pallone's statement on the evening news. He processed the information the way most recreational users processed it, as a scandal involving a specific individual, not as evidence of a structural condition. The specific individual had been punished. The companies had implemented new policies. The problem had been addressed. He entered his contests the following Saturday. The platform did not inform him that his cumulative loss of $1,520 placed him in a cohort whose spending exceeded the recreational average by a factor of 4. The platform's responsible gaming tools were available in the account settings. He had not activated them. The platform did not prompt him to activate them. The platform's interface surfaced the contest lobby, the salary cap builder, and the deposit screen. It did not surface the transaction history that would have shown him, in a single table, that he had deposited $1,740 and withdrawn $220, and that the difference between those numbers was growing with each passing week. He was not unique. He was a cluster. He was a segment. He was a data point in a database that contained millions of records, and his pattern, replicated across thousands of users in hundreds of cities, was the pattern that funded the prize pools, the platform's rake, the advertising blitz, and the venture capital returns. The system did not know his name. It knew his classification. It knew his deposit frequency, his session timing, his contest preferences, his response rate to promotional offers. It knew that he responded to bonus credit emails at a rate 23% higher than the segment average. It knew that his deposits increased on Saturdays between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. during the window when the system had inferred from behavioral patterns it could not explain but could predict he was at home with time to play. The system had learned his rhythm. The system used his rhythm to send him offers calibrated to arrive during the window when his probability of depositing was highest. The offers were not targeted at him as an individual. They were targeted at his segment. But the segment's behavioral profile was specific enough that the targeting functioned, in practice, as a personalized intervention delivered to a man whose cumulative losses were growing and whose deposits were increasing in response to promotional offers timed to the hour of his maximum receptivity. The coach did not know this. The coach entered his contests on Saturday mornings while his daughters ate cereal and his wife reviewed the weekend schedule. The coach believed he was playing a game of skill. He was. Skill mattered. His skill was insufficient to overcome the structural advantages of the professional participants who occupied the same contest fields, and his skill was insufficient to overcome the mathematical certainty that over an extended period of play, the platform's 10% rake would erode his balance with the quiet inevitability of interest compounding in the wrong direction. The advertisements had told him he could win big. The advertisements were not false. Users did win big. The 1.3% won big. The coach was not in the 1.3%. The coach was in the 98.7%, and the 98.7% funded the prizes, the rake, and the machine. The machine processed his deposits without judgment. The machine classified his behavior without interpretation. The machine predicted his next deposit with a probability it updated after each session. The machine did not know that he was a high school football coach in New Jersey who loved the sport the way he had loved it since Rutgers, who had played fantasy football for 20 years and who had been converted by $1 billion in advertising and a push notification timed to his Saturday morning from a fan into a revenue source. The machine did not know that in November, Karen would open the joint checking account statement and count the DK charges. She would count them twice. The total, across 9 weeks, would be $1,740 in deposits against $220 in withdrawals, and the difference between those numbers would produce a conversation at the kitchen table, after the girls were in bed, that the platform's responsible gaming tools were designed to prevent, but that the platform's interface was designed to defer. The conversation would be quiet, the conversation would be specific. The conversation would involve the soccer registration due in January, the property tax payment due in December, and the $1,520 that was no longer available for either. The platform would not be present for the conversation. The platform would not be informed of the conversation. The platform's systems would register only that the coach's deposit frequency declined in the second week of November, that his account transitioned from the high-frequency cohort to the at-risk cohort, and that the re-engagement promotional offer sent on November 14th at 8:17 a.m., a $25 bonus credit timed to his Saturday morning window, was not opened. The system would classify his non-response. The system would update its probability models. The system would route its promotional budget to the next user in the segment whose deposit probability exceeded the threshold. The machine knew his number. The number was sufficient.